I'm in conversation with a lot of activists in Iran's Azerbaijan who are actually engaging with different forms of activism to protect language rights in the Iranian context. I'm supervising even a few students who are focusing on those struggles. But it was a fantastic opportunity for me to join this conversation, because I thought I could just connect with a larger audience of Turkish-speaking people and populations. As we all know, there are a lot of different kinds of Turkishers in different amazing contexts, actually. So I thought it would be wonderful to be in conversation with them, share some of what work with them, and learn from their experiences as well. So I thought probably the best topic that I can discuss today is somehow the continuity of my research on multilingualism and possibilities of creating mother tongue-based multilingual education in the Iranian plateau, the continuity of that conversation in the kind of larger area of the Silk Roads, particularly the emerging Silk Roads. I thought that would connect with a lot of Turkic cultures all around that region. As we all know, actually, the Turks have been very, very instrumental in different historical periods to create the Silk Roads and to maintain the Silk Roads. So I thought that would be interesting to just actually introduce my new project, which is language and literacy and literature education in the Silk Roads region. So I think it's not, for those of us who have been brought up in that region, I don't know, places like Pakistan, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, I think it's not really difficult to recognize the Silk Roads. We have been brought up with the idea of the Silk Roads, and through stories and literature and oral narratives of different generations of people who have been living in that area. But I thought we could take a look at this to refresh our memory. So when we're talking about the Silk Roads, we're really talking about any place from the Mediterranean Sea to China. And we're talking about a sophisticated and complex network of trade routes, which traditionally connected Europe and China. Peter Frankopan has written a very influential book, actually, called The Silk Roads: A New History of the World. I think he has been instrumental in reviving conversations about the Silk Roads and its importance, particularly in the current kind of historical period. When he tries to introduce the Silk Roads to a Western audience, he usually shows this picture. I have borrowed that from one of his, this is a screenshot of one of his presentations that you can find on YouTube under the title Global Change in the 20th Century. I think he has got an amazing way to introduce the Silk Roads to a Western audience who might know very little about the history of the Silk Roads. He says, just think about the areas in the world where we hear every day on news that are problematic. There is war, there is conflict, there are terrorist attacks. And he just pops up these kind of explosions on the map. And he says, this is the Silk Road. So when we're talking about the Silk Roads, we're talking about Syria, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about different parts of Kurdistan and Afghanistan. So he has a very interesting way of introducing the Silk Roads, just trying to help the audience see that the Silk Roads region is mainly an area of the world today, which is really on fire in different places. And I don't think it's accidental. The Silk Roads were the center of the world and trade and intellectual exchange from the 2nd century BCE up to the 18th century. But from the 18th century, there was a drastic shift in the power and in the world of commerce and I think consequently the intellectual world. So the shift actually was the result of the new Anglo-American trade routes, which replaced the traditional Silk Road's trade routes. So after that shift, apparently, I think we see a connection between maintaining these new trade routes, Anglo-American trade routes, and the destruction of the traditional Silk Roads region at different places. So if we just want to highlight some Anglo-American policies that have resulted in that destruction, in the destruction of the traditional Silk Roads, I think these are just a few examples, and I'm not a political scientist, but the Partition of India, I think, cut off all the routes between really Central Asia and Asia. The British creation of today's Middle East. So in ancient Persian literature, as far as I know, probably Turkish literature, there wasn't anything called the Middle East. So the Middle East was a British invention to actually create a distinction between the Middle East and the East. Western support for nationalist military dictatorships and regimes, particularly, I think, when we look back at the beginning of the 20th century, the rise of people like Ataturk in Turkey and Reza Khan, and the other kind of military regimes in the region, from Syria. Some of them actually existed, like Syria, like Jordan. So all these kind of nationalist, somehow narrow-minded ideologically military regimes, and of course creating war and conflict in different ways. I think over the past 2 weeks, a video of Margaret Thatcher is just shared on Twitter, all over the Persian-speaking kind of Twitter. That's a reminder of her meeting with a large group of Afghan jihadists, where she promises £2,000, actually a new aid package to support their activities. Those Afghan jihadists are actually today's Taliban and Al-Qaeda people. Thatcher addresses them and says, I want to say that the hearts of the people of the free world are with you. So I see a clear connection between maintaining the kind of the new the 18th century the maritime trade routes which emerged in the 18th century, and the destruction of the traditional Silk Roads. Seemingly, all Western policies somehow have been instrumental in cutting off those traditional links. So this meeting happened in 1981, but people are sharing that because probably just 10 days ago, there was a bomb attack targeting schoolgirls in Kabul. But probably I think it was 8 or 10 days ago. I think more than about 85 girls were killed in this bomb attack. So the policy seems to have been continual. And as you see, I think this destruction has particularly included educational settings and students and teachers in different ways. I'm going to talk about the connection with education in more detail later. But I think it was important to highlight the connection between this shift of central power in the world. Things are changing these days. So with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, I think the equations are changing drastically and rapidly. So with the rise of China, we see a revival of the Silk Roads of the Silk Roads regions and the traditional connections between Central Asia, West Africa, Northern Africa, somehow Southern Europe and the Caucasus. So we see a revival of the connection between these areas and China. So the question is, what does it mean for people who have been traditionally actually the bridge between China and Europe, and how they're going to react to this? So from 18th century up to now, seemingly there has been a fascination with what has been happening in the new kind of center of power in the world and center of commerce in the world. And there has been a fascination with what people have been doing in the West, to the degree that, for instance, countries like Iran and Turkey, I think, started to copy ideologies and structures and institutions of the West, practically oblivious to the fact that there could be potential connections that could be made between the countries in the region. So everybody in that region has been looking towards the West. I think currently, particularly, I think in the past decade, we see a huge shift to the East. So there is more money in China. It makes perfect sense to just look to China as a source of power and potential. So I think the problem I see that is emerging in the Silk Roads region, in between these two centers of power, is there has been a shift from, okay, this is the source of money and power, let's deal with the West, suddenly to let's deal with China. So China is very active these days in Pakistan. They recently signed a contract with Iran. China is very active in Africa. So suddenly everybody is looking at China as this new source of power. My argument is, if we really want to, if the countries in the traditional Silk Roads, the countries between the two kind of centers of huge centers of trade, Europe and China, if these countries between these two poles want really to prosper and to make use of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, rather than looking at the West or at the East, while probably they're doing that and while they're engaging with both China and the West, they really need to seriously think about engaging in the region between themselves as well. I think that's a very important link that I feel is missing in today's calculations. So I think it is important to think about how these countries not only deal with China and of course deal with the West, but they have to think about finding ways to really create new bonds between themselves. Is the fact that as Parekhanna says, the new Silk Road is made of iron. So the re-emerging Silk Roads are not actually the traditional Silk Roads using traditional technology. I don't know that they don't include inns and caravans and intellectual hubs, because the Chinese Silk Roads, the Chinese initiative, is really based on the railway system. I think it has consequences. So I think the Chinese are really thinking about just sending their own products to Europe. So the new Silk Road is made of iron. That's very important to pay attention to. It is important because the new center of power, China, is not necessarily interested in the human capital and the cultural capital in the Silk Roads, in the traditional Silk Roads regions. They're interested in land routes and natural resources. They typically don't have a need for local workers. So what has happened with China? China typically brings in Chinese workers, which makes perfect sense because of the population and because China is using a lot of these infrastructure projects as job-making projects for its own population as well, and particularly for skilled workers like engineers and technicians. So there is not really that need for local workers. And when there is need, for instance, like the case with China, with Africa actually, there are not enough skilled and trained and educated workers in these regions to work with Chinese companies, let alone lack of knowledge of kind of Mandarin as the language which facilitates this connection. So I think it's not an accident that a lot of Chinese universities are giving scholarships to students from Africa. They bring them to China, they train them, then they use them in those African contexts. I don't see any kind of concern or conversation in places like Iran. I know less about Turkey, but I feel that might be the case for Turkey as well, about training skilled workers in those regions in a way that they can be part of the Chinese initiative. In the same manner, the Chinese initiative does not need local goods or products, and I think it's quite understandable. They have their own products. They want to send it to Europe. I think it's up to countries in the region to think about different ways they can market the products, not only to use the initiative to be part of the business dealings with Europe, but even using the infrastructure of the Silk Roads to just trade among themselves and send the products to the neighboring nations. So I think it's very important to think about the character of the new emerging Silk Roads and think about these possible business connections as well. And what is important for me personally as an educational researcher, because of the nature of the new Silk Roads, there seems to be very little interest, at least from the Chinese side, in cultural and intellectual exchange, particularly among the different nations in this region. So I think we might be excited that China is rising and there are new possibilities in the Silk Roads, and the traditional Silk Roads countries and nations can benefit from those. But we really have to be careful about the differences between the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the traditional Silk Roads. I believe that, and it's not, and I'm not blaming the Chinese initiative. I think that's a fantastic initiative, but I think it's really up to the countries in the region to make the best use of this initiative and be actually a very important part of that. So for me, as an educational researcher, I think the question I have when I think about those regions, the questions are, how can education help the Silk Roads countries and communities maximize the participation in the initiative? As I said, people in this region really need to have trained, educated, skilled workers to engage with the Chinese initiative effectively, and in a way that they can continue the business networks they create and the opportunities that are created because of the initiative. The second question I have, which is really more directly related to what I do as a language and literacy educator, is how can multilingualism help these nations use the opportunities provided by the initiative, I mean the Chinese initiative, to rebuild traditional geopolitical, commercial, and cultural ties? So these are really the questions which are occupying my mind at the moment for my new project, some of it whose highlights I'm sharing with you today. So the connection between education and the Silk Roads is not an irrelevant question or a fancy question. It's a serious question, because traditionally, in the traditional Silk Roads region, when there was prosperity in that region, we had cities which were actually the centers of learning in the world. I think we have all heard the stories about the learning and education and philosophy and science in Bukhara. We know about the scientific discoveries that happened in Maragha and made it a center of mathematics. And we have heard a lot about Baghdad as well. So when as an educator, I think about that educational context and the connection between education and commerce and prosperity, I cannot help think about how do we compare today with those cities and that kind of glorious educational background that we had. This is just a snapshot of how we are doing, looking at literacy rates in the region, which is, I think, a very usual criterion when we want to see how different countries are doing when it comes to literacy. So things are not really nice in Syria. We know that the literacy rate is only 80%. We know that it is dropping because of the continual conflict. Things are not as well in Iraq either. It's 85%. Again, there is some research showing that in southern Iraq, illiteracy is increasing. So these are, of course, I opened the presentation with an emphasis on Western policies, particularly Anglo-American policies in the region. But now that you're talking about Syria and Iraq, it's not bad, and even Afghanistan, it's not really bad to just mention that this includes, I think, the drop of literacy rates in these countries includes the policies of larger countries like Iran and Turkey as well, because Iran and Turkey are involved in these two places. So practically all these kind of interference in different ways has resulted to the drop of literacy. We are less educated as a result of these policies. In Afghanistan, things are really not ideal, so as you can see, particularly when it comes to literacy rates for women. That's really unbelievable that just in our neighborhood, this huge and amazing country, Afghanistan, only less than 30% of women are educated. In Pakistan, we have the same scenario, just hardly more than half of the population are literate, and we're not even talking about highly educated, skilled workers. We're talking about people who can read and write, and are over 14 or 15. And women, less than half of women in Pakistan are not educated. So this picture actually tells me, as an educational researcher, that any possibility for prosperity in that region cannot happen without serious attention to literacy and education. Otherwise, I think what we are going to see in that region is really kind of the dominance of the Chinese ways and methods, which might bring some prosperity for short times. But I think it's really up to us to think about what it means to deal with this kind of rate of literacy in that region. Another important factor which has prevented and undermined the Silk Road's regions, the Silk Road's countries with kind of healthy education is toxic monolingual policies. We know that Pakistan has had a difficult history with mother tongue-based multilingual education and multilingualism. We all know about the separation between Western Pakistan, which is today's Pakistan, and Eastern Pakistan. And we know that the mother tongue, the mother language International Day came out of the uncomfortable and bloody conflicts that happened because of language rights. So Pakistan doesn't have a very good track record when it comes to multilingualism as a vehicle for increasing literacy engagement. Iran is again equally in a very bad shape when it comes to multilingual education. There are activists in our room, and I would love to hear from their experiences about this later on. I know that they have been working in the Iranian context. There is a systematic oppression of minoritized cultures and languages in Iran, and there is a strong awareness among these populations about this oppression and a strong resistance and actually activism. Turkey is probably one of the worst countries in the region when it comes to monolingualism. Turkey's affair with toxic monolingualism is very complex because unlike, for instance, nationalisms in Europe, where race was the center of nationalism, how bad it is. I think in Turkey it became even a bit more problematic because language became the center of Turkish nationalism. So I think in a way, I think the Turks have serious issues to deal with if they want to disentangle from their own traditional forms of nationalism. So and Turkey is pretty notorious when it comes to its language policy in departments of education, at least in North America, in the departments where I have been working in. So, so toxic monolingualism hasn't been really helpful when it comes to creating a nurturing context for education in this region. And these should change. So I think part of the picture I showed you as the cause of sustainable prosperity in the region, which is really the interaction between these nations and these cultures within the region rather than looking west or looking east. I think part and parcel of these interactions, I think, is fluid multilingualism. I think it's a respect for all the languages in the region and a concerted attempt to support all of these languages and their speakers. So I wrote a book called Who is Afraid of Multilingual Education? In this book, we focused on the Iranian context. However, the conversations that we had for the Iranian context, I think could apply to other places in the region as well. And I think these arguments could be the base of undermining ideologies that advocate for monolingualism in this region. As I said, I see multilingualism as part and parcel of the growth of the people of this region, but a kind of democratic growth that really applies to everyone. So in my book, I talk to some of the leading figures in multilingual education. I spoke with TongueBased Kangas, who has written a lot about language rights internationally. She has studied closely the struggles of language minority populations in Turkey as well. So I invite you to read that book and to read that conversation. I think that gives you a very good kind of theoretical framework for conversations about language rights. I spoke with Jim Cummins about pedagogies in the classroom when it comes to language education. So I wanted to know what different people in different areas in the world are doing in their schools and the classrooms to mobilize a pedagogy which is based on multilingualism. My conversations with Jim Cummins were important from another angle as well, because he's a Canadian scholar. So I think Canada has done relatively okay when it comes to the bilingual system they have created, French and English, and all the complexities involved in that in that system. So I thought it would be really inspirational to see how the Canadians are dealing with issues about multilingualism. I talked to Ajit Mohanty about the Indian context. I think Indian context is a fascinating context. I think particularly for people who have rigid monolingual views of education, I think it's a very didactic exercise to, I think, just to listen to scholars like Ajit Mohanty from India. And Steve Bahri actually talked to me about Central Asia and Western China and their experiences with multilingualism. But let's connect with today's conversation as well. If we want fluid multilingualism in the region, I think we really need to really fight hard against monolingual against arguments that advocate for monolingual systems of education. They're not really that complex, and we all know about them. I just go through some of these arguments and quickly tell you how we refuted these arguments in this book. So the first argument we dealt with was a common language creates a united nation. We know that this is a very old-fashioned kind of 19th century European nationalism ideology. We know that countries which speak the same language are not necessarily united. There is no possibility that the US and the UK and Australia and New Zealand will ever be one country one day. So it is really it is somehow ridiculous to suggest that a common language can create a common nation. We have the other, I think for the same kind of, another example for the same argument is really a Spanish-speaking countries. So think about, there is no probability that all the Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America will be one country one day, and I think it's not even reasonable that they should be, based on my experiences as a Persian-speaking person. Think about the countries of Tajikistan and Iran. I mean, when Tajikistan was oppressed by kind of a Stalinist communism and they couldn't celebrate Nowruz, Iran became the protector of that tradition. Now, as Iran is getting increasingly ideological and aggressive in oppression of traditional kind of traditional practices, Tajikistan is leading, for instance, somehow in the Persian-speaking world, Tajikistan is trying to protect Nowruz as a social practice. So I'm not sure if that's a really good idea that countries that speak the same language should really join and become one. The opposite is true as well. There are a lot of languages spoken in India, but it has never been an issue. So if there has been kind of conflicts in India, it has been really more about religion and other issues rather than language. So this is really it cannot be scientifically backed in any way that a nation needs a language. I always characterize it as an illusion rather than anything else. The second argument is mother tongue-based multilingual education will cause separatism and political disintegration. There is zero evidence that that's true. Actually, all the evidence we have is quite the opposite. The best example, I think, is the example of Pakistan. I think the Pakistani government in a very rational way insisted that everybody had to speak Urdu. They broke the country up to different parts. In different presentations, I've always given the example that actually Professor Mohanty shared with me about India, about the Boodoo population in one region of India. So the state, the Indian state, was oppressing the language rights of the Boodoo population. The Boodoos didn't like it, understandably. They took drastic measures, which led even to different forms of violence and terrorism. As soon as the rights were recognized, peace was established. So all the arguments we have are actually the opposite of, all the evidence we have actually refute this argument. Seemingly the trend is quite the opposite. Again, I think Canada is another example. With the recognition of the French language, Canada actually enjoyed the possibility of having a united country rather than two separate nations. The third argument is mother tongue-based multilingual education costs too much. This is not a valid argument either. Even when you are sustaining a monolingual educational system, you have costs. If that educational system is not costing any money, I think you're not doing a good job, because you need to update the textbooks, you need to train the teachers all the time. So that argument is not valid in any form. There are challenges involved, definitely. I think bringing together a community of educators and policymakers who are committed to mother tongue-based multilingual education might take some time and resources. However, in the long run, with the prosperity that you create, I think you can cover all the expenses that you might have. In the book, we give multiple examples of how it is possible, and money is not really the main issue. Another argument is students should adopt the language of success as a pragmatic move. We know this argument is irrational in different ways. I'm currently in the United States. All African Americans in the United States speak perfect English, but I think a legitimate question is why they're not successful based on the definitions that we have of success. So I think in the Iranian context, the example which comes to mind is people who are actually taking goods illegally from Iran, between Iran, Turkey, and Iraq. A lot of them are Kurdish-speaking people. They speak perfect Persian, but they're not successful because they speak at least economically successful because they speak the dominant language. They have to smuggle things, and they get killed in the process. So the idea that the students who speak the minority, the dominant language, are going to be successful economically is irrational and has no no scientific base practically. And finally, dominant languages enjoy natural superiority because of the linguistic structure and historical privilege. Those of you who are Turkish-speaking people and who come from the Iran, I think you must be familiar with this. For instance, the kind of exaggeration when it comes to the importance of Persian as a historical language. At least as far as I know, in linguistics, there are no scientists and scholars who believe that languages are innately superior to other languages. All languages have equal potential. All languages are important in different ways. If you feel that your language is dominant, it's not because your language is better. It's because you're more powerful, and you have been systematically engaging in oppressing other people, including oppressing the languages and literatures. So that's the only reason that your language appears to be naturally superior. It's not your language which is superior, it's you are superior because of unfair power relations. So these are the arguments that we refute in that book, and I think it was important to highlight these because I think as we advocate a multilingual system, I think we're going to receive these arguments over and over again in different variations, but they're really the same, and there is no basis whatsoever, scientific basis, and there is no evidence to support these arguments. What I suggest, as I highlighted during the presentation for the region, is moving beyond these arguments to create an actual multilingual system where there is no minority language, in the sense that those languages are banned to be spoken, and those languages are not supported by the central governments or by the governments and the capitals that distribute budgets for education. So the model that I am proposing actually for the Silk Roads, I think it includes larger countries like Iran and Turkey, which have to, I think, act as quickly as possible, because there are larger countries with a lot of cultural diversity. But that actually includes smaller nations as well, like Azerbaijan or even Armenia, or Georgia. I think it's very important to consider all these possibilities for creating multilingual educational systems. So the system that I propose has 4 layers actually. So I think the larger kind of framework is considering mother tongue-based multilingual education. So by this, I mean creating, for instance, in the Iranian context, creating schools where both the dominant language or the official language or the national language or whatever you want to call it, the language that has facilitated communication over decades, should still be part of the educational system. But when you have large populations of people who have different mother tongues, those mother tongues should be part of the process of education in immersion schools. So like French immersion schools in Canada, for instance, I can imagine that, for instance, in the Iranian context, we could have Turkish emergency schools and Kurdish emergency schools and Baluchi and Persian schools. So I think we should move towards mother tongue based multilingual education. That's the same case actually with Turkey as well. I think it's quite possible, and I think it's recommended that in Turkey we should have bilingual Kurdish and Turkish schools. I think we have been very late. We should really start a conversation about how to put this into practice. The second level is avoiding a standardization of language varieties. So what I mean by that is, I think we should move from speaking about, for instance, Persian or Turkish or Kurdish to really focusing on these languages as Turkishes and Kurdishes, because we really don't have one. I mean, you should educate me on that, but we don't have one Turkish language. So all these Turkish-speaking people all over this region have their own histories, and they have their own cultures, and they have their own Turkishes, which are all amazing. And I think they host a lot of history and culture. So I think it's very, very important to avoid a standardization of these language varieties. And there is a good model for that. Actually, Kurdish scholars have been pioneers of creating this idea. A very good friend of mine, Jafar Sheikh-ul-Islami, and the famous, well-known Kurdish linguist, Amir Hassanpour, have created a model that avoids standardizing the Kurdish language. So what they have suggested instead is keeping all these Kurdishes and identifying different standard varieties. So it's very, very important while we are trying to challenge dominant languages, like, for instance, the dominance of languages, national languages, like, for instance, Persian in Iran or Turkish in Turkey. It's very important not to fall into the trap of creating another kind of standardized language within those. So these languages have different histories. So I think we could use the model that Kurdish scholars have created to avoid a standardization of language varieties and create a space for all language varieties, for all Turkishes and Baluchis and Persians and Kurdishes. Within our schools, I think if we have a mother tongue-based multilingual education, I think it's going to be in areas that you have a large population of the speakers of that language. So in Turkey, it might be the Kurdish-speaking areas. I think let's not forget that there are millions of Syrian students in Turkey now. I haven't read anything about creating bilingual Turkish-Arabic system of education for those students. But the kind of broader mother tongue-based multilingual education system could apply to those populations with, where there is a large number of students. However, this doesn't mean that we cannot still employ translingual pedagogies within dominant language schools to help minoritized students. So if there is migration from Tabriz to Tehran, our students in Tehran don't have to just don't have to be forced to speak Persian from day one. I think we really need to develop within the Persian kind of language schools, for instance, in Tehran, we need to develop translingual pedagogies that embrace students' languages. It may not be a kind of bilingual system, but still there are programs and there are teaching methods that the teachers of the dominant language could use to celebrate and to recognize those students' languages, to invite the families to be a part of the process of education. So I have been in those schools, and I know that there is systematic discrimination against minoritized populations when they go to regions like Persian-speaking regions, and there is practically zero recognition of the mother tongues. So I think translingual pedagogies are very important to be employed in those regions as well, in dominant language instruction schools as well. And there are other possibilities that we can employ as well. I think one that I'm particularly interested in, actually I'm writing an article about this, is the story of the alphabet in the region. Seemingly there has been a lot of confusion about which alphabet is the best alphabet. Azerbaijan is a very good example of that, with movements between, I think, Arabic alphabet to Cyrillic alphabet and Latin alphabet. So there is that kind of confusion. Turkey did under Ataturk, I think, did an unprecedented kind of, somehow in modern history, experiment with changing the alphabet. The story of the alphabet is really a hot debate in Tajikistan. So the Tajiks are considering which alphabet to use. I think that's the case with Turkish-speaking people in Iran as well, because they feel somehow comfortable with the Latin alphabet, because they can read what the Turkish-speaking fellow writers are writing in other parts of the region, if they know that alphabet. So I think that's a very, very important question. The suggestion I have for this is we really shouldn't be confused about this, as long as we can just teach both alphabets. So I don't see why the Tajiks cannot simply keep writing in Cyrillic, but at the same time teach the Persian alphabet. So please note that we're not talking about teaching a new language. We're talking about the alphabet for the same language. And I think it doesn't take really ages to learn that alphabet. I think if you're a Persian speaker, I think in a matter of weeks, you can really just learn the new alphabet, and you can read the texts. Of course, I'm not really advocating that for every student, but I think there are different possibilities where you can do that. I think if you want to study Persian literature at Tehran University, I believe you need to have a course where you study the Tajik alphabet. I think I don't really see how it's not possible. If Persian literature and is your life and is your business, I think it's very easy to learn that alphabet. I believe, for instance, in Iran's Azerbaijan, it is very important for the Turkish-speaking people to learn the alphabet that other Turkish-speaking people are using. So that could be an addition to the Perso-Arabic alphabet that are already using, and it's not going to take a lot of time. You correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of you have already done that. A lot of you are using both alphabets. So I think that should be part and parcel of the educational system as well. I don't believe that we have to omit alphabets or change dramatic changes and shifts. I believe we need really to add the alphabet whenever needed, and whenever we feel that the students are gonna make use of the alphabet. So these are the 4 different layers of multilingual education that I believe Silk Road's nations and communities should engage with. My proposal, what I propose today, which is really the kind of broad outlines of my new project, the Silk Roads project, my proposal is nothing new. We have had that experience in this region for centuries. I think things have started to change when we started to look west and when we started to borrow educational ideologies of the West, which were industrial, colonial, multilingual, and wrong in different ways. So what I'm proposing is not new. My favorite Armenian director is a director called Parajanov. His Color of Pomegranates is a very famous film. The film is about a biography of Sayed Nova, an Armenian poet, or ashuk. Actually, now that reminds you of the word ashik in Turkish, who wrote and performed in the Armenian, Georgian, Turkish, and Persian languages. So multilingualism has always been part and parcel of the intellectual relations in the Silk Roads region. Closer probably to the audience of this talk, Turkish-speaking intellectuals and educators, Rumi flourished wrote in Persian, but flourished in a Turkish-speaking context. So it's really a pity to think about how many, for instance, Kurdish Rumis or Maulanas never flourished in Turkey today because of compulsory monolingualism. It's really sad to think about how many amazing Turkish poets could have flourished like Rumi did under the Ottoman Empire in Iran, or Kurdish poets because of the dominance of Persian. So by no means is my proposal something new. What I am proposing is actually a return to the fluid multilingualism in the Silk Roads region. And I think it's quite doable. And I think in many ways, I think different people are practicing that. I want to finish this presentation with just highlighting that because I connected my presentation with the Silk Roads, with business, with the initiative, with the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it had a kind of economic undertone. So I cannot finish this presentation without highlighting that although I just framed the presentation through a kind of economic lens, all conversations about multilingualism are always connected with conversations about human rights, cultural diversity, anti-discriminatory education. So I'm not suggesting we should have multilingualism to make more money only, although I think it's very, very important. But that should be a kind of sustainable source of money and business and commerce. But this conversation is important for me and for other scholars in language education because it connects with issues about social justice and respect for all the members of this huge kind of family of the Silk Roads. And let's not forget, when we're talking about cultural diversity, sometimes they are presented as if they are Western inventions. So when we talk about multilingual education, we often, I think, particularly in Western academia, we often write about those as if these are Western inventions, but that's not the case. Those of you who have read Jalaluddin Balkhi or Rumi, you know that he talked about cultural diversity, multiculturalism, interface relations. So even we have the discourses already in the region that could support a fluid multilingual system that could govern kind of our educational structures in order to facilitate communication and connection between different communities and different countries in the Silk Roads region. Thank you very much for